Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: John, Colette, Sarah, and Pam. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us cover the costs of recording, production, and distribution while keeping each weekly episode ad-free and relaxed for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com where you can support us with a one-time tip. No subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly, and off we go. In honor of Halloween and the spooky season, tonight we're relaxing with the Book of Werewolves, being an account of terrible superstition by Sabine Baring-Gould, first published in 1865 by Smith, Elder & Co., London. Let's begin. The Book of Werewolves, Chapter 1. Introductory. I shall never forget the walk I took one night in Vienna after having accomplished the examination of an unknown druidical relic, the Pierre l'Abbé, at La Rondelle near Champigny. I had learned of the existence of this cromlech only on my arrival at Champigny in the afternoon, and I had started to visit the curiosity without calculating the time it would take me to reach it and to return. Suffice it to say that I discovered the venerable pile of gray stones as the sun set, and that I expended the last lights of evening in planning and sketching. I then turned my face homeward. My walk of about 10 miles had wearied me, coming at the end of a long day's posting, and I had lamed myself in scrambling over some stones to the Gaulish relic. A small hamlet was at no great distance, and I betook myself thither in the hopes of hiring a trap to convey me to the post-house. But I was disappointed. Few in the place could speak French, and the priest, when I applied to him, assured me that he believed there was no better conveyance in the place than a common charrue with its solid wooden wheels, nor was a riding horse to be procured. The good man offered to house me for the night, but I was obliged to decline, as my family intended starting early on the following morning. Out spake then the mayor, "Monsieur can never go back tonight across the flats, because of the, and his voice dropped, the loup-garou." "He says that he must return," replied the priest in patois, "but who will go with him?" "Aha, Monsieur le Curé, it is all very well for one of us to accompany him, but think of the coming back alone." "Then two must go with him," said the priest, "and you can take care of each other as you return." "Picou tells me that he saw the werewolf only this day last week," said a peasant. "He was down by the hedge of his buckwheat field, and the sun had set, and he was thinking of coming home when he heard a rustle on the far side of the hedge. He looked over and there stood the wolf, as big as a calf against the horizon, its tongue out and its eyes glaring like marsh fires. Mon Dieu, you won't catch me going over the Marais tonight. Why, what could two men do if they were attacked by that wolf fiend? It is tempting Providence, said one of the elders of the village. No man must expect the help of God if he throws himself wilfully in the way of danger. Is it not so, Monsieur le Curé? I heard you say as much from the pulpit on the first Sunday in Lent, preaching from the Gospel. That is true, observed several, shaking their heads. His tongue hanging out, and his eyes glaring like marsh fires, said the confidant of Picou. Mon Dieu, if I met the monster I should run, quoth another. I quite believe you, Cortez. I can answer for it that you would, said the mayor. As big as a calf, threw in Picou's friend. If the loup-garou were only a natural wolf, why then, you see, the mayor cleared his throat. You see, we should think nothing of it. But, Monsieur le Curé, it is a fiend, a worse than fiend, a man-fiend, a worse than man-fiend, a man-wolf-fiend. But what is the young monsieur to do? Asked the priest, looking from one to another. Never mind, said I, who had been quietly listening to their patois, which I understood. Never mind, I will walk back by myself, and if I meet the loup-garou, I will crop his ears and tail, and send them to Monsieur le Maire with my compliments. A sigh of relief from the assembly, as they found themselves clear of the difficulty. He is English, said the mayor, shaking his head, as though he meant that an Englishman might face the devil with impunity. A melancholy flat was the Marais, looking desolate enough by day, but now in the gloaming tenfold as desolate. The sky was perfectly clear, and of a soft blue-gray tinge, illumined by the new moon, a curve of light approaching its western bed. To the horizon reached a fen, blacked with pools of stagnant water, from which the frogs kept up an incessant trill through the summer night. Heath and fern covered the ground, but near the water grew dense masses of flag and bulrush, amongst which the light wind sighed wearily. Here and there stood a sandy knoll, capped with firs, looking like black splashes against the gray sky. Not a sign of habitation anywhere, the only trace of men being the white straight road extending for miles across the fen. That this district harbored wolves is not improbable, and I confess that I armed myself with a strong stick at the first clump of trees through which the road dived. This was my first introduction to werewolves, and the circumstance of finding the superstition still so prevalent first gave me the idea of investigating the history and the habits of these mythical creatures. I must acknowledge that I have been quite unsuccessful in obtaining a specimen of the animal, but I have found its traces in all directions, and just as the paleontologist has constructed the labyrinthodon out of its footprints in marl and one splinter of bone, so may this monograph be complete and accurate, although I have no chained werewolf before me, which I may sketch and describe from the life. The traces left are indeed numerous enough, and though perhaps like the dodo or the dinormis, the werewolf may have become extinct in our age, yet he has left his stamp on classic antiquity. He has trodden deep in northern snows, has ridden roughshod over the medievals, and has howled amongst oriental sepulchres. He belonged to a bad breed, and we are quite content to be freed from him and his kindred, the vampire and the ghoul. Yet who knows? We may be a little too hasty in concluding that he is extinct. He may still prowl in Abyssinian forests, range still over Asiatic steppes, and be found howling dismally in some padded room of a Hanwell or a Bedlam. In the following pages I design to investigate the notice of werewolves to be found in the ancient writers of classic antiquity, those contained in the northern sagas, and lastly the numerous details afforded by the medieval authors. In connection with this, I shall give a sketch of modern folklore relating to lycanthropy. It will then be seen that under the veil of mythology lies a solid reality, that a floating superstition holds in solution a positive truth. This I shall show to be an innate craving for blood implanted in certain natures, restrained under ordinary circumstances, but breaking forth occasionally, accompanied with hallucination, leading in most cases to cannibalism. I shall then give instances of persons thus afflicted who were believed by others and who believed themselves to be transformed into beasts, and who, in the paroxysms of their madness, committed numerous murders and devoured their victims. I shall next give instances of persons suffering from the same passion for blood, who murdered for the mere gratification of their natural cruelty, but who were not subject to hallucinations, nor were addicted to cannibalism. I shall also give instances of persons filled with the same propensities, who murdered and ate their victims, but who were perfectly free from hallucination. Chapter 2. Lycanthropy among the Ancients. What is lycanthropy? The change of man or woman into the form of a wolf, either through magical means, so as to enable him or her to gratify the taste for human flesh, or through judgment of the gods in punishment for some great offense. This is the popular definition. Truly, it consists in a form of madness, such as may be found in most asylums. Among the ancients, this kind of insanity went by the names of lycanthropy, kuanthropy, or boanthropy, because those afflicted with it believed themselves to be turned into wolves, dogs, or cows. But in the north of Europe, as we shall see, the shape of a bear, and in Africa that of a hyena, were often selected in preference, a mere matter of taste. According to Marcellus Sidetes, of whose poem a fragment exists, men are attacked with this madness chiefly in the beginning of the year, and become most furious in February, retiring for the night to lone cemeteries and living precisely in the manner of dogs and wolves. Virgil writes in his 8th Eclogue, Has herbas, ace hec ponto mihi lecta venena, ipse dedit moeris, nascuntur plurima ponto, his ego saepe lupam, fiere et se conducere silvis, moeram saepe animas, imis exiri sepulchris, atque satas alio, vidi traducere messis. And Herodotus says, it seems that the Neuri are sorcerers, if one is to believe the Scythians and the Greeks established in Scythia, for each Neurian changes himself once in the year into the form of a wolf, and he continues in that form for several days, after which he resumes his former shape. See also Pomponius Mela. There is a fixed time for each Neurian at which they change, if they like, into wolves, and back again into their former condition. But the most remarkable story among the ancients is that related by Ovid in his Metamorphoses, of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, who, entertaining Jupiter one day, set before him a hash of human flesh to prove his omniscience, whereupon the god transferred him into a wolf. In vain he attempted to speak. From that very instant his jaws were bespluttered with foam, and only he thirsted for blood, as he raged amongst flocks and panted for slaughter. His vesture was changed into hair, his limbs became crooked. A wolf. He retains yet large trace of his ancient expression. Hoary he is as afore, his countenance rabid. His eyes glitter savagely still, the picture of fury. Pliny relates from Avantes that on the festival of Jupiter Lycaeus, one of the family of Antaeus was selected by lot and conducted to the brink of the Arcadian lake. He then hung his clothes on a tree and plunged into the water, whereupon he was transformed into a wolf. 9 years after, if he had not tasted human flesh, he was at liberty to swim back and resume his former shape, which had in the meantime become aged, as though he had worn it for 9 years. Agriopus relates that Daemonetus, having assisted at an Arcadian human sacrifice to Jupiter Lycaeus, ate of the flesh, and was at once transformed into a wolf, in which shape he prowled about for 10 years, after which he recovered his human form, and took part in the Olympic Games. The following story is from Petronius. My master had gone to Capua to sell some old clothes. I seized the opportunity and persuaded our guest to bear me company about 5 miles out of town, for he was a soldier and as bold as death. We set out about cockcrow, and the moon shone bright as day, when, coming among some monuments, my man began to converse with the stars, whilst I jogged along singing and counting them. Presently I looked back after him, and saw him strip and lay his clothes by the side of the road. My heart was in my mouth in an instant. I stood like a corpse, when, in a crack, he was turned into a wolf. Don't think I'm joking. I would not tell you a lie for the finest fortune in the world. But to continue, after he was turned into a wolf, he set up a howl and made straight for the woods. At first I did not know whether I was on my head or my heels, but at last going to take up his clothes, I found them turned into stone. The sweat streamed from me, and I never expected to get over it. Melissa began to wonder why I walked so late. Had you come a little sooner, she said, you might at least have lent us a hand, for a wolf broke into the farm and has butchered all our cattle. But though be got off, it was no laughing matter for him, for a servant of ours ran him through with a pike. Hearing this, I could not close an eye, but as soon as it was daylight, I ran home like a peddler that has been eased of his pack. Coming to the place where the clothes had been turned into stone, I saw nothing but a pool of blood, and when I got home, I found my soldier lying in bed, like an ox in a stall, and a surgeon dressing his neck. I saw at once that he was a fellow who could change his skin, and never after could I eat bread with him. No, not if you would have killed me. Those who would have taken a different view of the case are welcome to their opinion. If I tell you a lie, may your genie confound me. As everyone knows, Jupiter changed himself into a bull, Hecuba became a dog, Actaeon a stag, the comrades of Ulysses were transformed into swine, and the daughters of Proteus fled through the fields, believing themselves to be cows, and would not allow anyone to come near them, lest they should be caught and yoked. Saint Augustine declared in his De Civitate Dei that he knew an old woman who was said to turn men into asses by her enchantments. Apuleius has left us his charming romance of the Golden Ass, in which the hero, through injudicious use of a magic salve, is transformed into that long-eared animal. It is to be observed that the chief seat of lycanthropy was Arcadia, and it has been very plausibly suggested that the cause might be traced to the following circumstance. The natives were a pastoral people, and would consequently suffer very severely from the attacks and depredations of wolves. They would naturally institute a sacrifice to obtain deliverance from this pest and security for their flocks. This sacrifice consisted in the offering of a child, and it was instituted by Lycaon. From the circumstance of the sacrifice being human, and from the peculiarity of the name of its originator, rose the myth. But on the other hand, the story is far too widely spread for us to attribute it to an accidental origin or to trace it to a local source. Half the world believes or believed in werewolves, and they were supposed to haunt the Norwegian forests by those who had never remotely been connected with Arcadia, and the superstition had probably struck deep its roots into the Scandinavian and Teutonic minds ages before Lycaon existed, and we have only to glance at Oriental literature to see it as firmly engrafted in the imagination of the Easterns. Chapter 3: The Werewolf in the North. In Norway and Iceland, certain men were said to be Egi Einhammer, not of one skin, an idea which had its roots in paganism. The full form of this strange superstition was that men could take upon them other bodies, and the natures of those beings whose bodies they assumed. The second adopted shape was called by the same name as the original shape, Hammer, and the expression made use of to designate the transition from one body to another was skipta homum, or at hamas, whilst the expedition made in the second form was the hamfer. By this transfiguration extraordinary powers were required. The natural strength of the individual was doubled or quadrupled. He acquired the strength of the beast in whose body he traveled, in addition to his own, and a man thus invigorated was called Hamrammer. The manner in which the change was effected varied. At times a dress of skin was cast over the body, and at once the transformation was complete. At others the human body was deserted, and the soul entered the second form, leaving the first body in a cataleptic state, to all appearance dead. The second Hammer was either borrowed or created for the purpose. There was yet a third manner of producing this effect. It was by incantation, but then the form of the individual remained unaltered, though the eyes of all beholders were charmed so that they could only perceive him under the selected form. Having assumed some bestial shape, the man who is Igi Einhammer is only to be recognized by his eyes, which by no power can be changed. He then pursues his course, follows the instincts of the beast whose body he has taken, yet without quenching his own intelligence. He is able to do what the body of the animal can do, and do what he as man can do as well. He may fly or swim if he is in the shape of bird or fish. If he has taken the form of a wolf, or if he goes on a gandreith or wolf's ride, he is full of the rage and malignity of the creatures whose powers and passions he has assumed. I will give a few instances of each of the three methods of changing bodies mentioned above. Freya and Frigg had their falcon dresses, in which they visited different regions of the earth, and Loki is said to have borrowed these, and to have then appeared so precisely like a falcon that he would have escaped detection but for the malicious twinkle of his eyes. In the Velander is the following passage. From the south flew the maidens athwart the gloom, Alvit the young, to fix destinies. They on the sea strand sat them to rest, these damsels of the south, fair linen spun. One of them took Egil to press, fair maid in her dazzling arms. Another was Svanhwit, who wore swan feathers, and the third, their sister, pressed the white neck of Voland. The introduction of Somund tells us that these charming young ladies were caught when they had laid their swan skins beside them on the shore, and were consequently not in a condition to fly. In like manner were wolves' dresses used. The following curious passage is from the wild saga of the Volsungs. It is now to be told that Sigmund thought Sinfjotli too young to help him in his revenge, and he wished first to test his powers. So during the summer they plunged deep into the wood and slew men for their goods. And Sigmund saw that he was quite of the Volsung stock. Now it fell out that as they went through the forest collecting monies, that they lighted on a house in which were two men sleeping, with great gold rings on them. They had dealings with witchcraft, for wolfskins hung up in the house above them. It was the 10th day on which they might come out of their second state. They were kings' sons. Sigmund and Sinfjotli got into the habits and could not get out of them again. And the nature of the original beasts came over them, and they howled as wolves. They learned, both of them, to howl. Now they went into the forest, and each took his own course. They made the agreement together that they should try their strength against as many as 7 men, but not more, and that he who was ware of strife should utter his wolf's howl. "Do not fail in this," said Sigmund, "for you are young and daring, and men would be glad to chase you." Now each went his own course, and after that they had parted, Sigmund found men, so he howled. And when Sinfjotli heard that, he ran up and slew them all. Then they separated, and Sinfjotli had not been long in the wood before he met with 11 men. He fell upon them and slew them every one. Then he was tired, so he flung himself under an oak to rest. Up came Sigmund and said, "Why did you not call out?" Sinfjotli replied, what was the need of asking your help to kill 11 men? Sigmund flew at him and rent him so that he fell, for he had bitten through his throat. That day they could not leave their wolf forms. Sigmund laid him on his back and bare him home to the hall, and sat beside him, and said, "Deuce take the wolf forms." Volsung Saga, Chapter 8. There is another curious story of a werewolf in the same saga which I must relate. Now he did as she requested, and hewed down a great piece of timber, and cast it across the feet of those 10 brothers seated in a row in the forest, and there they sat all that day and on till night. And at midnight there came an old she-wolf out of the forest to them, as they sat in the stocks, and she was both huge and grimly. Now she fell upon one of them and bit him to death, and after she had eaten him all up she went away. And next morning Signy sent a trusty man to her brothers to know how it had fared with them. When he returned he told her of the death of one, and that grieved her much, for she feared it might fare thus with them all, and she would be unable to assist them. In short, 9 nights following came the same she-wolf at midnight, and devoured them one after another till all were dead, except Sigmund, and he was left alone. So when the 10th night came, Signy sent her trusty man to Sigmund her brother with honey in his hand, and said that he was to smear it over the face of Sigmund and to fill his mouth with it. Now he went to Sigmund and did as he was bid, after which he returned home, and during the night came the same she-wolf as was her wont, and reckoned to devour him like his brothers. Now she snuffed at him where the honey was smeared, and began to lick his face with her tongue, and presently thrust her tongue into his mouth. He bore it ill and bit into the tongue of the she-wolf. She sprang up and tried to break loose, setting her feet against the stock so as to snap it asunder, but he held firm and ripped the tongue out by the roots, so that it was the death of the wolf. It is the opinion of some men that this beast was the mother of King Sigurd, and that she had taken this form upon her through devilry and witchcraft. Volsung Saga, Chapter 5. There is another story bearing on the subject in the Hrolfs Saga Kraka, which is pretty. It is as follows. In the north of Norway, in upland dales, reigned a king called Hring, and he had a son named Bjorn. Now it fell out that the queen died, much lamented by the king and by all. The people advised him to marry again, and so he sent men south to get him a wife. A gale and fierce storm fell upon them, so that they had to turn the helm and run before the wind, and so they came north to Finnmark, where they spent the winter. One day they went inland and came to a house in which sat 2 beautiful women who greeted them well, and inquired whence they had come. They replied by giving an account of their journey and their errand, and then asked the women who they were, and why they were alone, and far from the haunts of men, although they were so comely and engaging. The elder replied that her name was Ingebjorg, and that her daughter was called Fit, and that she was the Finn king's sweetheart. The messengers decided that they would return home if Fit would come with them and marry King Hring. She agreed, and they took her with them and met the king, who was pleased with her, and had his wedding feast made, and said that he cared not that she was not rich. But the king was very old, and that the queen soon found out. There was a carle who had a farm not far from this king's dwelling. He had a wife and a daughter who was but a child, and her name was Bera. She was very young and lovely. Bjorn the king's son and Bera the carle's daughter were wont as children to play together, and they loved each other well. The carle was well-to-do. He had been out harrying in his young days, and he was a doughty champion. Bjorn and Bera loved each other more and more, and they were often together. Time passed, and nothing worth relating occurred, but Bjorn the king's son waxed strong and tall, and he was well skilled in all manly exercises. King Hring was often absent for long, harrying foreign shores, and Vit remained at home and governed the land. She was not liked of the people. She was always very pleasant with Bjorn, but he cared little for her. It fell out once that the King Hring went abroad, and he spake with his queen that Bjorn should remain at home with her to assist in the government, for he thought it advisable, the queen being haughty and inflated with pride. The king told his son Bjorn that he was to remain at home and rule the land with the queen. Bjorn replied that he disliked the plan and that he had no love for the queen, but the king was inflexible and left the land with a great following. Bjorn walked home after his conversation with the king and went up to his place, ill-pleased and red as blood. The queen came to speak with him and to cheer him, and spake friendly with him, but he bade her be off. She obeyed him that time. She often came to talk with him and said how much pleasanter it was for them to be together than to have an old fellow like Hring in the house. Bjorn resented this speech and struck her a box in the ear and bade her depart, and he spurned her from him. She replied that this was ill done to drive and thrust her away, and said, "You think it better, Bjorn, to sweetheart a carle's daughter than to have my love and favor. A fine piece of condescension and a disgrace it is to you. But before long something will stand in the way of your fancy and your folly." Then she struck at him with a wolfskin glove, and said that he should become a rabid and grim wild bear, and said, "You shall eat nothing but your father's sheep, which you shall slay for your food, and never shall you leave this state." After that Bjorn disappeared, and none knew what had become of him, and men sought but found him not, as was to be expected. We must now relate how that the king's sheep were slaughtered, 60 at a time, and it was all the work of a grey bear, both huge and grimly. One evening it chanced that the carle's daughter saw this savage bear coming towards her, looking tenderly at her, and she fancied that she recognized the eyes of Bjorn the king's son, so she made a slight attempt to escape. Then the beast retreated, but she followed it till she came to a cave. Now when she entered the cave there stood before her a man, who greeted Bera the carle's daughter, and she recognized him, for he was Bjorn, Hring's son. Overjoyed were they to meet, so they were together in the cave a while, for she would not part from him when she had the chance of being with him. But he said that this was not proper, that she should be there by him, for by day he was a beast, and by night a man. Hring returned from his harrying, and he was told the news of what had taken place during his absence, how that Bjorn his son had vanished, and also how that a monstrous beast was up the country, and was destroying his flocks. The queen urged the king to have the beast slain, but he delayed a while. One night, as Bera and Bjorn were together, he said to her, "Methinks tomorrow will be the day of my death, for they will come out to hunt me down. But for myself I care not, for it is little pleasure to live with this charm upon me, and my only comfort is that we are together. But now our union must be broken. I will give you the ring which is under my left hand. You will see the troop of hunters tomorrow coming to seek me, and when I am dead, go to the king and ask him to give you what is under the beast's left front leg. He will consent." He spoke to her of many other things till the bear's form stole over him, and he went forth a bear. She followed him and saw that a great body of hunters had come over the mountain ridges and had a number of dogs with them. The bear rushed away from the cavern, but the dogs and the king's men came upon him, and there was a desperate struggle. He wearied many men before he was brought to bay, and had slain all the dogs, but now they made a ring about him, and he ranged around it, but could see no means of escape. So he turned to where the king stood, and he seized a man who stood next to him and rent him asunder. Then was the bear so exhausted that he cast himself down flat, and at once the men rushed in upon him and slew him. The carle's daughter saw this, and she went up to the king and said, "Sire, wilt thou grant me that which is under the bear's left foreshoulder?" The king consented. By this time his men had nearly flayed the bear. Bera went up and plucked away the ring and kept it, but none saw what she took, nor had they looked for anything. The king asked her who she was, and she gave a name, but not her true name. The king now went home, and Bera was in his company. The queen was very joyous and treated her well, and asked who she was, but Bera answered as before. The queen now made a great feast and had the bear's flesh cooked for the banquet. The carle's daughter was in the bower of the queen and could not escape, for the queen had a suspicion who she was. Then she came to Bera with a dish quite unexpectedly, and on it was bear's flesh, and she bade Bera eat it. She would not do so. "Here is a marvel," said the queen. "You reject the offer which a queen herself deigns to make to you. Take it at once, or something worse will befall you." She bit before her, and she ate of that bite. The queen cut another piece and looked into her mouth. She saw that one little grain of the bite had gone down, but Bera spat out all the rest from her mouth, and said she would take no more, though she were tortured or killed. "Maybe you have had sufficient," said the queen, and she laughed. Hrolf's Saga Kraka, chapters 24 to 27, condensed. In the Faroese song of Finnur hin Frithi, we have the following verse. "When this peril Finn saw, that witchcraft did him harm, then he changed himself into a werewolf. He slew many thus." In all these cases the change is of the form. We shall now come to instances in which the person who is changed has a double shape, and the soul animates one after the other. The Ynglinga saga says of Odin that he changed form. The bodies lay as though sleeping or dead, but he was a bird or a beast, a fish or a woman, and went in the twinkling to far distant lands, doing his own or other people's business. In like manner, the Danish king Harald sent a warlock to Iceland in the form of a whale, whilst his body lay stiff and stark at home. The already quoted saga of Hrolf Krake gives us another example, where Bodvar Bjarki, in the shape of a huge bear, fights desperately with the enemy, which has surrounded the hall of his king, whilst his human body lies drunkenly beside the embers within. In the Vansdala saga, there is a curious account of 3 Finns who were shut up in a hut for 3 nights, and ordered by Ingemund, a Norwegian chief, to visit Iceland and inform him of the lie of the country where he was to settle. Their bodies became rigid, and they sent their souls the errand, and on their awaking at the end of the 3 days, gave an accurate description of the Vatsdal, in which Ingemund was eventually to establish himself. But the saga does not relate whether these Finns projected their souls into the bodies of birds or beasts. The third manner of transformation mentioned was that in which the individual was not changed himself, but the eyes of others were bewitched, so that they could not detect him, but saw him only under a certain form. Of this there are several examples in the sagas, but I will translate the most curious, which is that of Odd, Katla's son, in the Eyrbyggja saga. Gerid, housewife in Mafalith, sent word into Bolstad that she was ware of the fact that Odd, Katla's son, had hewn off Odd's hand. Now when Thorarin and Arnkel heard that, they rode from home with 12 men. They spent the night in town and rode on next morning to Holt. Katla sat on the high seat spinning yarn, and she bade Odd sit beside her. Also she bade her women sit each in her place and hold their tongues. For, said she, I shall do all the talking. Now when Arnkel and his company arrived, they walked straight in, and when they came into the chamber, Katla greeted Arnkel and asked the news. He replied that there was none, and he inquired after Odd. Katla said that he had gone to Breidavik. We shall ransack the house, though, quoth Arnkel. Be it so, replied Katla, and she ordered a girl to carry a light before them and unlock the different parts of the house. All they saw was Katla spinning yarn off her distaff. Now they search the house but find no Odd, so they depart. But when they had gone a little way from the garth, Arnkel stood still and said, How know we but that Katla has hoodwinked us, and that the distaff in her hand was nothing more than Odd? Not impossible, said Thorarin. Let us turn back. They did so, and when those at Holt saw that they were returning, Katla said to her maids, Sit still in your places, Odd and I shall go out. Now, as they approached the door, she went into the porch and began to comb and clip the hair of her son Odd. Arnkel came to the door and saw where Katla was, and she seemed to be stroking her goat, and disentangling its mane and beard and smoothing its wool. So he and his men went into the house, but found not Odd. Katla's distaff lay against the bench, so they thought that it could not have been Odd, and they went away. However, when they had come near the spot where they had turned before, Arnkel said, Think you not that Odd may have been in the goat's form? There is no saying, replied Thorarin, but if we turn back, we will lay hands on Katla. We can try our luck again, quoth Arnkel, and see what comes of it. So they returned. Now, when they were seen on their way back, Katla bade Odd follow her, and she led him to the ash heap, and told him to lie there and not to stir on any account. But when Arnkel and his men came to the farm, they rushed into the chamber and saw Katla seated in her place spinning. She greeted them and said that their visits followed with rapidity. Arnkel replied that what she said was true. His comrades took the distaff and cut it in twain. "Come now," said Katla, "you cannot say when you get home that you have done nothing, for you have chopped up my distaff." Then Arnkel and the rest hunted high and low for Odd, but could not find him. Indeed, they saw nothing living about the place, beside a boar pig which lay under the ash heap, so they went away once more. Well, when they got halfway to Mophaleth, came Gerid to meet them with her workmen. They had not gone the right way to work in seeking Odd, she said, but she would help them. So they turned back again. Gerid had a blue cloak on her. Now when the party was seen and reported to Katla, and it was said that they were 13 in number, and one had on a colored dress, Katla exclaimed, "That troll Gerid is come. I shall not be able to throw a glamour over their eyes any more." She started up from her place and lifted the cushion of the seat, and there was a hole and a cavity beneath. Into this she thrust Odd, clapped the cushion over him, and sat down, saying she felt sick at heart. Now when they came into the room, there were small greetings. Gerid cast of her the cloak and went up to Katla, and took the sealskin bag which she had in her hand, and drew it over the head of Katla. Then Gerid bade them break up the seat. They did so and found Odd. Him they took and carried to Bulin's head, where they hanged him, but Katla they stoned to death under the headland. And with that charming tale, we've reached the end of Chapter 3. So that seems as good a place as any to end this evening's reading from the Book of Werewolves, which seems surprisingly short on werewolves. But never mind. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, happy Halloween and good night.